Mr Kelly. Mr Band.
Thank you. So I just want to pick up where we left off last time, talking about the bank's strong commitment to two-degree economy, two-degree society. It's something that's been part of the bank's policies for quite some time. Since we were here last, the government has ratified the Paris Agreement, and there's also been a significant speech from APRA, your regulator, a couple of weeks ago from Mr Summerhayes. Have you read Mr Summerhayes' speech?
I've read excerpts of it.
You'll know that one of the things that he talks about is science is coming along. We now understand a lot more than we used to. And one of the things that we understand is that to have, he says, a 2 in 3 chance of keeping global warming below 2 degrees, which is the sort of at least a generally accepted minimum, then we need to have a carbon budget. And he says that means there's only so much fossil fuels that can be burnt. Do you agree with your regulator on that point?
As a general statement, yes.
And he says that the carbon budget is 800 gigatonnes, which is the equivalent of 25 years of business as usual. So if we do what the current federal government's doing, which is increase pollution, that 25 years might actually be brought forward. The only hope we'd have of extending that would be if we cut pollution drastically. Do you have any reason to doubt the regulator's timeframe?
No, but then I'm not a client scientist.
Yeah, but your bank has made, I mean, you win sustainability awards in part because of your commitment to this 2-degree policy, correct?
Yes.
And it's something that has been part of the bank's thinking for a number of years.
Yes, it has.
And so presumably you don't make a commitment to 2 degrees idly. You do it on the understanding that that means, I think in paraphrasing words in some of your policies, significant transformations in the economy, Australia and globally.
Yes, that's right. We're committed to the 2-degree economy, and that implies a reasonable transition over the next 30 years.
So one of the parts of the transition that APRA is referring to, APRA refers to, in the speech, to a legal opinion from Mr Noel Hutley, given at the end of last year. Are you familiar with that legal opinion?
Not specifically, but carry on.
Mr Hutley's opinion that's paraphrased in APRA is that the risks, that there are physical risks that come with climate change, so sea level rises might affect property values and the like, but there's also those transition risks. Mr Hutley, the legal opinion says that directors are potentially liable if they don't take all of those kinds of risks into account. Is that something that you broadly agree with?
Well, we certainly take them into account. We've explicitly amended our various risk statements to call out the risk of the impact of climate change in a variety of respects, including sea levels rising and the like, and that is a topic that we discuss in our various sustainability reviews at a board level and in our risk management committee, so yes.
So we're talking about changes potentially over the next couple of decades, potentially even sooner if we keep increasing pollution. One of the points that APRA makes is that, and that Mr Hutley makes, APRA references, is that might mean that 80% of existing fossil fuel reserves need to stay in the ground. Are you aware of the people are making the argument, including your regulator, that might be what we need to do to comply with 2 degrees?
I'm aware of the argument, but again, I'm not a climate scientist. So.
But I'm not worried about the climate science. You're not a climate scientist, but you are involved every day in managing risk. And when your regulator says you've just signed up to something that might mean 80% of existing fossil fuel reserves have to stay in the ground, and action might be needed on that in the next couple of decades, that's something presumably you take seriously.
Certainly.
And that might mean reviewing your existing loan book or reviewing future loans or support that you give to business and saying, well, something that we might have supported in the past, we now no longer can finance because of the risk associated with your assets becoming stranded assets.
Yes, that's true, and that's a process we're going through at the moment. We're currently reviewing, we've said publicly, we're currently reviewing and updating our environmental policies. We already have, as I believe you know, very strict environmental guidelines that factor into all of our lending decisions. That has been in place for a number of years, and that includes commitments to financing the development of clean energy and working with every individual transaction to make sure that it does meet our standards.
Thanks. And so, in the context of reviewing and constantly reviewing the update of the science, does that mean you are also reviewing what you said to me last time, which is that when I said that it might come to the point where Westpac can no longer finance projects that expand the global stock of fossil fuel reserves, given that 80% of them need to stay in the ground. You said, I'm not sure it will get to that point. Are you now, in light of what APRA has said and in light of the ratification of by the government of the Paris Climate Agreement, is that something that's now subject to review? Might you get to the point where you say we cannot fund the expansion of new fossil fuel reserves?
I think given the overall time frame of the transition, yes, it may come to that point. And the point we would make, and I suppose what I was getting at there, is that our focus is really on transition and continuing to support the development of clean energy alternatives while recognizing that the economy still needs power.
I understand, but I'm talking about digging up new coal. I'm talking about digging up new coal, and the NAB, for example, has said, I mean, one of the big projects that's being discussed at the moment is the Adani mine, the Carmichael mine in Queensland. NAB has said, NAB is not involved and has no plans to be involved in any financing for the Carmichael coal mine. Given everything that you've just said, and that a commitment to 2 degrees might mean not expanding future fossil fuel reserves, are you also in a position to state that you won't fund the expansion of the Adani Carmichael coal mine?
Well, Mr. Pan, I think you're aware of our policy. We've stated it publicly on many occasions, which is we don't comment on individual projects, but we do make the point that our environmental controls are very strict, and every single project, if we were asked to look at it, would go through those screens, and if it didn't pass those screens, we would not proceed.
So have you done an analysis of what the pollution impacts of the coal mine in the Galilee Basin might be?
We have not been asked to fund that project, and therefore it's premature to make any comment on it, and other than we're not going to comment prospectively on a particular customer.
But except that you've just said a few minutes ago, at some point you might get to the stage where your policies mean to stick with 2 degrees, you won't fund the expansion of future fossil fuel reserves. That point might come very soon. So let's take Adani out of it. You might get to the stage where you don't fund new coal mines in Australia. Is that correct?
That is possible, yes.
And that might...
But as for the timing of that, I really don't know. And as I say,
Okay.
It's premature for me to comment on it because we're in the process of updating
But as to the timing of it,
now.
as to the timing of it, APRA is saying, and you agree, that those risks aren't in the future. We're not talking about climate change happening sometime in the future. We're talking about it happening now. We're talking about transition risks happening now. Those risks and those decisions might have to happen this year, mightn't they?
Well, I think you started with talking about transition over multiple decades, and as I
But
say,
I'm
I think
talking
it's
about
premature.
financing a project that will run for decades and that is based on contracts to sell coal over the next 10 or 20, 30 years. It's presumably part of the financial viability of the project.
Well, it's very rare, and I'm not aware of many, if any, projects that we finance that last for 20 years. Our financings tend to be much shorter term in nature, particularly in the institutional banking side of the business.
But it might, if you are presented with you're doing a review this year of your, as you just said, of what it means to stick with 2 degrees and what that might mean for your lending practices. Is that, and you're going to make a statement on that later in the year, is that right?
That's right.
And that at some point, the bank's policies might be that you're not going to lend to expand coal mines. Might that happen this year as part of this review?
Well, I think it's probably, I know that the policies of the Green Party and others would like us to stop all financing for fossil fuels. We don't think that's practical right now at the moment, but we're certainly committed to supporting that transition over time.
Well, so you're saying you accept that at some point you might not lend to future fossil fuel projects, and you accept that 2 degrees means that we may at some point in the future, and the question is when, no longer be burning fossil fuels and we'll be running on renewable energy. But that point doesn't have to come at any particular time on your watch. I mean, I'm suggesting to you that if you think that as a result of the review you're undertaking this year, you can still have a climate risk policy that says you will fund new coal mines, then you either don't understand what 2 degrees means, or you're actively misleading the market by saying you're committed to 2 degrees.
I think we've been very transparent and clear about what we're saying, which is we accept that there's a need for a transition. We also accept that as a major bank, we have a responsibility to ensure that we support the economy. Part of that is supporting the generation of power, and part of that power generation at the moment, as we've seen very clearly in the last few months, is dependent on existing approaches to generating power. But equally, we're extremely proud of our position as the world's most sustainable bank, and we don't want to lose that position.
And I suggest to you that
we're
would be at risk if you think that you can be the world's most sustainable bank and fund the expansion of the Adani coal mine. You're in dream world. I think that would be the nail in the coffin. Last question about, just because I have to move on, just about Adani. Are your staff free to campaign against the funding of the Adani coal mine by Westpac or anyone else?
Of course.
So can you give a guarantee that no staff member is suffering or would suffer any adverse action or threat of adverse action if they took a position to say that Adani coal mine should not proceed and should not be funded by Westpac?
Our staff, of whom I am immensely proud, are absolutely encouraged to be their whole selves, and part of that is having a culture where people speak up on their views. I have regularly been questioned by staff members in internal meetings on this matter, and I encourage them to do that, and in fact I've awarded them prizes for the courage to speak up. So no, of course we will not intimidate people from expressing their views, and we encourage them to do that. And I believe that's an important part of a healthy culture. These are difficult issues, and we absolutely want to get to the right answer, and part of that is an open conversation.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Band.